The 12 Brothers. There were once upon a time a king and a queen, who lived happily together and had 12 children. But they were all boys. Then said the king to his wife, "If the 13th child, which you are about to bring into the world, is a girl, the 12 boys shall die, in order that her possessions may be great, and that the kingdom may fall to her alone." He even caused 12 coffins to be made, which were already filled with shavings, and in each lay a little death pillow. And he had them taken into a locked-up room, and then gave the queen the key of it, and bade her not to speak of this to anyone. The mother, however, now sat and lamented all day long, until the youngest son, who was always with her, and whom she had named Benjamin from the Bible, said to her, "Dear mother, why are you so sad?" "Dearest child," she answered, "I may not tell you." But he let her have no rest until she went and unlocked the room, and showed him the 12 coffins ready filled with shavings. Then she said, "My dearest Benjamin, your father has had these coffins made for you and your 11 brothers. If I bring a little girl into the world, you are all to be killed and buried in them." And as she wept while she was saying this, the son comforted her and said, "Weep not, dear mother, we will save ourselves and go hence." But she said, "Go forth into the forest with your 11 brothers, and let one sit constantly on the highest tree which can be found, and keep watch, looking towards the tower here in the castle. If I give birth to a little son, I will put a white flag, and then you may venture to come back. But if I bear a daughter, I will hoist a red flag, and then fly hence as quickly as you're able, and may the good God protect you. And every night I will rise up and pray for you, in winter that you may be able to warm yourself at a fire, and in summer that you may not faint away in the heat." After she had blessed her sons therefore, they went forth into the forest. They each kept watch in turn, and sat on the highest oak and looked towards the tower. When 11 days had passed and the turn had come to Benjamin, he saw that the flag was being raised. It was, however, not white, but the blood-red flag which announced that they were all to die. When the brothers heard that, they were very angry, and said, "Are we all to suffer death for the sake of a girl? We swear that we will avenge ourselves. Wheresoever we find a girl, her red blood shall flow." Thereupon they went deeper into the forest, and in the midst of it, where it was the darkest, they found a little bewitched hut, which was standing empty. Then said they, "Here we will dwell, and you, Benjamin, you are the youngest and the weakest. You shall stay home and keep house. We others will go out and fetch food." Then they went into the forest and shot hares, wild deer, birds and pigeons, and whatsoever there was to eat. This they took to Benjamin, who had to dress it for them in order that they might appease their hunger. They lived together 10 years in the little hut, and the time did not appear long to them. The little daughter which their mother and queen had given birth to was now grown up. She was good of heart and fair of face, and had a golden star on her forehead. Once on a great washing she saw 12 men's shirts among the things, and asked her mother, "To whom do these 12 shirts belong? For they are far too small for father." Then the queen answered with a heavy heart, "Dear child, these belong to your 12 brothers." Said the maiden, "Where are my 12 brothers? I have never yet heard of them." She replied, "God knows where they are. They are wandering about in the world." Then she took the maiden and opened the chamber for her, and showed her the 12 coffins with the shavings and the death pillows. "These coffins," said she, "were destined for your brothers, who went away secretly before you were born." And she related to her how everything had happened. Then said the maiden, "Dear mother, weep not. I will go and seek my brothers." So she took the 12 shirts and went forth, and straight into the great forest. She walked the whole day, and in the evening she came to a bewitched hut. Then she entered it and found a young boy, who asked, "From whence do you come, and whither are you bound?" and was astonished that she was so beautiful, and wore royal garments, and had a star on her forehead. And she answered, "I am a king's daughter. I am seeking my 12 brothers, and I will walk as far as the sky is blue until I find them." and she showed him the 12 shirts that belonged to them. Then Benjamin saw that she was his sister, and said, "I am Benjamin, your youngest brother." And she began to weep for joy, and Benjamin wept also, and they kissed and embraced each other with the greatest love. But after this he said, "Dear sister, there is still one difficulty. We have agreed that every maiden whom we meet shall die, because we have been obliged to leave our kingdom on account of a girl." Then said she, "I will willingly die, if by so doing I can save my 12 brothers." "No," answered he, "you shall not die. Seat yourself beneath this tub until our 11 brothers come, and then I will soon come to an agreement with them." She did so, and when it was night, the others came from hunting, and their dinner was ready. And as they were sitting at the table and eating, they asked, "What news is there?" Said Benjamin, "Don't you know anything?" "No," they answered. He continued, "You have been in the forest, and I have stayed at home, and yet I know more than you do." "Tell us then," they cried. He answered, "But promise me that the first maiden who meets us shall not be killed." "Yes," they all cried, "she shall have mercy, only do tell us." Then said he, "Our sister is here." And he lifted up the tub, and the king's daughter came forth, in her royal garments with the golden star on her forehead, and she was beautiful, delicate and fair. Then they were all rejoiced, and fell on her neck, and kissed and loved her with all their hearts. Now she stayed at home with Benjamin, and helped him with the work. The 11 went into the forest and caught game, and deer and birds and wood pigeons, that they might have food. And the little sister and Benjamin took care to make it ready for them. She sought for wood for cooking, and herbs for vegetables, and put the pans on the fire so that the dinner was always ready when the 11 came. She likewise kept order in the little house, and put beautifully white clean coverings on the little beds, and the brothers were always contented, and lived in great harmony with her. Once upon a time the 2 at home had prepared a wonderful feast, and when they were all together they sat down and ate and drank, and were full of gladness. There was, however, a little garden belonging to the bewitched house, wherein stood 12 lily flowers, which were likewise called student lilies. She wished to give her brothers pleasure, and plucked the 12 flowers, and thought she would present each brother with one while at dinner. But at the same moment that she plucked the flowers, the 12 brothers were changed into 12 ravens, and flew away over the forest, and the house and garden vanished likewise. And now the poor maiden was alone in the wild forest, and when she looked round, an old woman was standing near her, who said, "My child, what have you done? Why did you not leave the 12 white flowers growing? They were your brothers, who are now furthermore changed into ravens." The maiden said, weeping, "Is there no way of saving them?" "No," said the woman, "there is but one in the whole world, and that is so hard that you will not save them by it. For you must be dumb for 7 years, and you may not speak or laugh, and if you speak one single word, and only an hour of the 7 years is wanting, all is vain, and your brothers will be killed by the one word." Then said the maiden in her heart, "I know with certainty that I shall set my brothers free," and went and sought the high tree, and seated herself in it, and spun, and neither spoke nor laughed. Now it so happened that a king was hunting in the forest, who had a great greyhound, which ran to the tree in which the maiden was sitting, and sprang about it, whining and barking at her. Then the king came by and saw the beautiful king's daughter, with the golden star on her brow, and was so charmed with her beauty that he called to ask her if she would be his wife. She made no answer, but nodded a little with her head. So he climbed up the tree himself, carried her down, placed her on his horse, and bore her home. Then the wedding was solemnized with great magnificence and rejoicing, but the bride neither spoke nor smiled. When they had lived happily together for a few years, the king's mother, who was a wicked woman, began to slander the young queen, and said to the king, "This is a common beggar girl whom you've brought back with you. Who knows what wicked tricks she practices secretly? Even if she be dumb, and not able to speak, she still might laugh for once. But those who do not laugh have bad consciences." At first the king would not believe it, but the old woman urged this so long, and accused her of so many evil things, that at last the king let himself be persuaded, and sentenced her to death. And now a great fire was lighted in the courtyard, in which she was to be burnt, and the king stood above at the window, and looked on with tearful eyes, because he still loved her so much. And when she was bound fast to the stake, and the fire was licking at her clothes with its red tongue, the last instants of the 7 years expired. Then a whirling sound was heard in the air, and 12 ravens came flying towards the place, and sank downwards. And when they touched the earth, they were her 12 brothers whom she had saved. They tore the fire asunder, extinguished the flames, set their dear sister free, and kissed and embraced her. And now as she dared to open her mouth and speak, she told the king why she had been dumb, and had never laughed. The king rejoiced when he had heard that she was innocent, and they all lived in a great unity until their death. The wicked stepmother was taken before the judge, and put into a barrel filled with boiling oil and venomous snakes, and died an evil death. Brother and Sister. Little brother took his little sister by the hand and said, "Since our mother died, we have no happiness. Our stepmother beats us every day, and if we could come near her, she kicks us away with her foot. Our meals are the hard crusts of bread that are left over, and the little dog under the table is better off, for she often throws it a choice morsel. God pity us, if our mother only knew. Come, we will go forth together into the wide world." They walked the whole day over meadows, fields, and stony places, and when it rained the little sister said, "Heaven and our hearts are weeping together." In the evening they came to a large forest, and they were so weary with sorrow and hunger in the long walk that they lay down in a hollow tree and fell asleep. The next day when they awoke, the sun was already high in the sky, and had shone hot into the tree. Then the brother said, "Sister, I am thirsty. If I knew of a little brook, I would go and just take a drink. I think I hear one running." The brother got up and took the little sister by the hand, and they set off to find the brook. But the wicked stepmother was a witch, and she had seen how the 2 children had gone away, and had crept after them secretly, as witches creep, and had bewitched all the brooks in the forest. Now when they found a little brook, leaping brightly over the stones, the brother was going to drink out of it. But the sister heard how it said as it ran, "Who drinks of me will be a tiger, who drinks of me will be a tiger." Then the sister cried, "Pray, dear brother, do not drink, or you will become a wild beast and tear me to pieces." The brother did not drink, although he was so thirsty, but said, "I will wait for the next spring." When they came to the next brook, the sister heard this also say, "Who drinks of me will be a wolf, who drinks of me will be a wolf." Then the sister cried out, "Pray, dear brother, do not drink, or you will become a wolf and devour me." The brother did not drink, and said, "I will wait until we come to the next spring, but then I must drink, say what you like, for my thirst is too great." And when they came to the 3rd brook, the sister heard how it said as it ran, "Who drinks of me will be a roebuck, who drinks of me will be a roebuck." The sister said, "Oh, I pray you, dear brother, do not drink, or you will become a roebuck, and run away from me." But the brother had knelt down at once by the brook, and had bent down and drunk some of the water, and as soon as the first drops touched his lips, he lay there in the form of a young roebuck. And now the sister wept over her poor bewitched brother, and the little roe wept also, and sat sorrowfully near her. But at last the girl said, "Be quiet, dear little roe, I will never, never leave you." Then she untied her golden garter and put it around the roebuck's neck, and she plucked rushes and wove them into the soft cord. This she tied to the little animal and led it on, and she walked deeper and deeper into the forest. And when they had gone a very long way, they had came at last to the little house, and the girl looked in. And as it was empty, she thought, "We can stay here and live." Then she sought for leaves and moss to make a soft bed for the roe, and every morning she went out and gathered roots and berries and nuts for herself, and brought tender grass for the roe, who ate out of her hand, and was content, and played round about her. In the evening, when the sister was tired and had said her prayer, she laid her head upon the roebuck's back. That was her pillow, and she slept softly on it. And if only the brother had his human form, it would have been a delightful life. For some time they were alone like this in the wilderness, but it happened that the king of the country held a great hunt in the forest. Then the blasts of the horns, the barking of the dogs, and the merry shouts of the huntsmen rang through the trees, and the roebuck heard all, and was only too anxious to be there. "Oh," said he to his sister, "let me be off to the hunt. I cannot bear it any longer." And he begged so much that at last she agreed. But said she to him, "Come back to me in the evening. I must shut my door for fear of the rough huntsman, so knock and say, 'My little sister, let me in, that I may know you.' And if you do not say that, I shall not open the door." Then the young roebuck sprang away. So happy was he and so merry in the open air. The king and the huntsmen saw the lovely animal, and started after him. But they could not catch him, and when they thought they had surely had him, away he sprang through the bushes and vanished. When it was dark he ran to the cottage, knocked, and said, "My little sister, let me in." Then the door was opened for him, and he jumped in, and rested himself the whole night through upon his soft bed. The next day the hunt began again, and when the roebuck once more heard the bugle horn and the ho-ho of the huntsman, he had no peace, but said, "Sister, let me out, I must be off." His sister opened the door for him and said, "But you must be here again in the evening, and say your password." When the king and his huntsmen again saw the young roebuck with the golden collar, they all chased him, but he was too quick and nimble for them. This lasted the whole day, but by the evening the huntsmen had surrounded him, and one of them wounded him a little in the foot, so that he limped and ran slowly. Then a hunter crept after him in the cottage, and heard how he said, "My little sister, let me in," and saw that the door was opened for him, and was shut again at once. The huntsman took notice of it all, and went to the king and told him what he had seen and heard. Then the king said, "Tomorrow we will hunt once more." The little sister, however, was dreadfully frightened when she saw that her fawn was hurt. She washed the blood off him, laid herbs on the wound, and said, "Go to your bed, dear roe, that you may get well again." But the wound was so slight that the roebuck next morning did not feel it any more, and when he again heard the sport outside, he said, "I cannot bear it, I must be there. They shall not find it so easy to catch me." The sister cried and said, "This time they will kill you, and I am alone in the forest, and forsaken by all the world. I will not let you out." "Then you will have me die of grief," answered the roe. "When I hear the bugle horns, I feel as if I must jump out of my skin." Then the sister could not do otherwise, but opened the door for him with a heavy heart, and the roebuck, full of health and joy, bounded into the forest. When the king saw him, he said to his huntsman, "Now chase him all day till nightfall, but take care that no one does him any harm." As soon as the sun had set, the king said to the huntsman, "Now come and show me the cottage in the wood." And when he was at the door, he knocked and called out, "Dear little sister, let me in." The door opened, and the king walked in, and there stood a maiden more lovely than any he had ever seen. The maiden was frightened when she saw, not her little roe, but a man came in, who wore a golden crown upon his head. But the king looked kindly at her, stretched out his hand, and said, "Will you go with me to the palace and be my dear wife?" "Yes, indeed," answered the maiden, "but the little roe must go with me. I cannot leave him." The king said, "It shall stay with you as long as you live, and shall want nothing." Just then he came running in, and the sister again tied him with the cord of rushes, took it into her own hand, and went away with the king from the cottage. The king took the lovely maiden upon his horse and carried her to his palace, where the wedding was held with a great pomp. She was now the queen, and they lived for a long time happily together. The roebuck was tended and cherished, and ran about in the palace garden. But the wicked stepmother, because of whom the children had gone out into the world, had never thought but that the sister had been torn to pieces by wild beasts in the wood, and that the brother had been shot for a roebuck by the huntsman. Now when she heard that they were so happy and so well off, envy and jealousy rose in her heart and left her no peace, and she thought of nothing but how she could bring them again to misfortune. Her own daughter, who was ugly as night and had only one eye, reproached her and said, "A queen! That ought to have been my luck." "Just be quiet," answered the old woman, and comforted her by saying, "When the time comes, I shall be ready." As time went on, the queen had a pretty little boy, and it happened that the king was out hunting. So the old witch took the form of a chambermaid, went into the room where the queen lay, and said to her, "Come, the bath is ready. It will do you good and give you a fresh strength. Make haste before it gets cold." Her daughter also was close by, so they carried the weakly queen into the bathroom and put her into the bath. Then they shut the door and ran away. But in the bathroom they had made a fire of such hellish heat that the beautiful young queen was soon suffocated. When this was done, the old woman took her daughter, put a nightcap on her head, and laid her in bed in the place of the queen. She gave her, too, the shape and look of the queen, only she could not make good the lost eye. But in order that the king might not see it, she was to lie on the side on which she had no eye. In the evening, when he came home and heard that he had a son, he was heartily glad, and was going to the bed of his dear wife to see how she was. But the old woman quickly called out, "For your life leave the curtains closed. The queen ought not see the light yet, and must have rest." The king went away and did not find out that the false queen was lying in the bed. But at midnight, when all slept, the nurse, who was sitting in the nursery by the cradle, who was the only person awake, saw the door open and the true queen walk in. She took the child out of the cradle, laid it on her arm, and suckled it. Then she shook up its pillow, laid the child down again, and covered it with a little quilt. And she did not forget the roebuck, but went into the corner where it lay, and stroked its back. Then she went quite silently out of the door again. The next morning the nurse asked the guards whether anyone had come into the palace during the night, but they answered, "No, we have seen no one." She came thus many nights and never spoke a word. The nurse always saw her, but she did not dare to tell anyone about it. When some time had passed in this manner, the queen began to speak in the night, and said, "How fares my child? How fares my roe? Twice shall I come, then never no more." The nurse did not answer, but when the queen had gone again, went to the king and told him all. The king said, "Ah, God, what is this? Tomorrow night I will watch by the child." In the evening he went into the nursery, and at midnight the queen again appeared and said, "How fares my child? How fares my roe? Once I will come, then never no more." And she nursed the child as she wanted to do before she disappeared. The king dared not speak to her, but on the next night he watched again. Then she said, "How fares my child? How fares my roe? This time I come, then never more." Then the king could not restrain himself. He sprang towards her and said, "You can be none other than my dear wife." She answered, "Yes, I am your dear wife." And at that same moment she received life again, and by God's grace became fresh, rosy, and full of health. Then she told the king of the evil deed which the wicked witch and her daughter had been guilty of towards her. The king ordered both to be led before the judge, and the judgment was delivered against them. The daughter was taken into the forest, where she was torn to pieces by wild beasts, but the witch was cast into the fire of the miserably burnt. And as soon as she was burnt to ashes, the roebuck changed his shape and received his human form again, and so the sister and brother lived happily together all their lives. Rapunzel. There were once a man and a woman who had long in vain wished for a child. At length the woman hoped that God was about to grant her desire. These people had a little window at the back of their house, from which a splendid garden could be seen, which was full of the most beautiful flowers and herbs. It was, however, surrounded by a high wall, and no one dared to go into it, because it belonged to an enchantress, who had great power and was dreaded by all the world. One day the woman was standing by this window, and looking down into the garden, she saw a bed which was planted with the most beautiful rampion Rapunzel, and it looked so fresh and green that she longed for it, and had the greatest desire to eat some. This desire increased every day, and as she knew that she could not get any of it, she quite pined away, and began to look pale and miserable. Then her husband was alarmed, and asked, "What ails you, dear wife?" "Ah," she replied, "if I can't eat some of that rampion, which is in the garden behind our house, I shall die." The man who loved her thought, "Sooner than let your wife die, bring her some of that rampion yourself, let it cost what it will." At twilight he chambered down over the wall into the garden of the enchantress, hastily clutched a handful of rampion, and took it to his wife. She at once made herself a salad of it, and ate it greedily. It tasted so good to her, so very good, that the next day she longed for it 3 times as much as before. If he was to have any rest, her husband must once more descend into the garden. In the gloom of the evening, therefore, he let himself down again. But when he had clambered down the wall, he was terribly afraid, for he saw the enchantress standing before him. "How can you dare," said she with angry look, "descend into my garden and steal my rampion like a thief? You shall suffer for it." "Ah," answered he, "let mercy take the place of justice. I only made up my mind to do it out of necessity. My wife saw your rampion from the window, and felt such a longing for it that she would have died if she had not got some to eat." Then the enchantress allowed her anger to be softened, and said to him, "If the case be as you say, I will allow you to take away with you as much rampion as you will. Only I make one condition. You must give me the child which your wife will bring into the world. It shall be well treated, and I will care for it like a mother." The man in his terror consented to everything, and when the woman was brought to bed, the enchantress appeared at once, gave the child the name of Rapunzel, and took it away with her. Rapunzel grew into the most beautiful child under the sun. When she was 12 years old, the enchantress shut her into a tower, which lay in a forest, and had neither stairs nor door, but quite at the top was a little window. When the enchantress wanted to go in, she placed herself beneath it and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair to me." Rapunzel had magnificent long hair, fine as spun gold, and when she heard the voice of the enchantress, she unfastened her braided tresses, wound them round with one of the hooks of the window above, and then her hair fell 20 eels down, and the enchantress climbed up by it. After a year or 2, it came to pass that the king's son rode through the forest and passed by the tower. Then he heard a song, which was so charming that he stood still and listened, and letting in her sweet voice resound. The king's son wanted to climb up to her, and looked for a door of the tower, but none was to be found. He rode home, but the singing had so deeply touched his heart that every day he went out into the forest and listened to it. Once when he was thus standing behind a tree, he saw that the enchantress came there, and he had heard how she cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Then Rapunzel let down the braids of her hair, and the enchantress climbed up to her. "If that is the ladder by which mounts, I too will try my fortune," said he, and the next day, when it began to grow dark, he went to the tower and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Immediately the hair fell down, and the king's son climbed up. At first Rapunzel was terribly frightened when a man, such as her eyes had never yet beheld, came to her. But the king's son began to talk to her quite like a friend, and told her that his heart had been so stirred that it had let him have no rest, and he had been forced to see her. Then Rapunzel lost her fear, and when he asked her if she would take him for her husband, and she saw that he was young and handsome, and she thought, "He will love me more than old Dame Gothel does," and she said yes, and laid her hand into his. She said, "I will willingly go away with you, but I do not know how to get down. Bring with you a skein of silk every time that you come, and I will weave a ladder with it, and when that is ready I will descend, and you will take me to your horse." They agreed that until that time he should come to her every evening, for the old woman came by day. The enchantress remarked nothing of this, until once Rapunzel said to her, "Tell me, Dame Gothel, how it happens that you are so much heavier for me to draw up than the young king's son. He is with me in a moment." "Ah, you wicked child," cried the enchantress, "what do I hear you say? I thought I had separated you from all the world, and yet you have deceived me." In her anger she clutched Rapunzel's beautiful tresses, wrapped them twice around her left hand, seized a pair of scissors with the right, and snip snap, they were cut off, and the lovely braids lay on the ground. And she was so pitiless that she took poor Rapunzel into a desert, where she had to live in great grief and misery. On the same day that she had cast out Rapunzel, however, the enchantress fastened the braids of hair which she had cut off to the hook of the window, and when the king's son came and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair," she let the hair down. The king's son ascended, but instead of finding his dearest Rapunzel, he found the enchantress, who gazed at him with wicked and venomous looks. "Ah," she cried mockingly, "you would fetch your dearest, but the beautiful bird sits no longer singing in the nest. The cat has got it, and will scratch out your eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to you. You will never see her again." The king's son was beside himself with pain, and in his despair he leapt down from the tower. He escaped with his life, but the thorns into which he fell pierced his eyes. Then he wandered quite blind about the forest, ate nothing but roots and berries, and did not but lament and weep over the loss of his dearest wife. Thus he roamed about in misery for some years, and at length came to the desert where Rapunzel, with the twins to which she had given birth, a boy and a girl, lived in wretchedness. He heard a voice, and it seemed so familiar to him that he went towards it, and when he approached, Rapunzel knew him and fell on his neck and wept. 2 of her tears wetted his eyes, and they grew clear again, and he could see with them as before. He led her to his kingdom, where he was joyfully received, and they lived for a long time afterwards, happy and contented. The 3 Little Men in the Wood. There was once a man whose wife died, and a woman whose husband died, and the man had a daughter, and the woman also had a daughter. The girls were acquainted with each other, and went out walking together, and afterwards came to the woman in her house. Then said she to the man's daughter, "Listen, tell your father that I would like to marry him, and then you shall wash yourself in milk every morning, and drink wine. But my own daughter shall wash herself in water, and drink water." The girl went home and told her father what the woman had said. The man said, "What shall I do? Marriage is a joy, and also a torment." At length, as he could come to no decision, he pulled off his boot, and said, "Take this boot. It has a hole in the sole of it. Go with it up to the loft, hang it in the big nail, and then pour water into it. If it hold the water, then I will again take the wife, but if it run through, I will not." The girl did as she was bid, but the water drew the hole together, and the boot came full to the top. She informed her father how it had turned out. Then he himself went up, and when he saw that she was right, he went to the widow and wooed her, and the wedding was celebrated. The next morning, when the 2 girls got up, there stood before the man's daughter milk for her to wash in, and wine for her to drink. But before the woman's daughter stood water to wash herself with, and water for drinking. On the second morning stood water for washing and water for drinking before the man's daughter as well as before the woman's daughter. On the third morning stood water for washing and water for drinking before the man's daughter, and milk for washing and wine for drinking before the woman's daughter. And so it continued. The woman became her stepdaughter's bitterest enemy. The woman became her stepdaughter's bitterest enemy, and day by day did her best to treat her still worse. She was also envious because her stepdaughter was beautiful and lovable, and her own daughter ugly and repulsive. Once in the winter, when everything was frozen as hard as stone, and hill and vale lay covered with snow, the woman made a frock of paper, called her stepdaughter, and said, "Here, put on this dress and go out into the wood, and fetch me a little basketful of strawberries. I have a fancy for some." "Good heavens," said the girl, "no strawberries grow in winter. The ground is frozen, and besides the snow has covered everything. And why am I to go in this paper frock? It is so cold outside that one's very breath freezes. The wind will blow through the frock, and the thorns tear it off my body." "Will you contradict me?" said the stepmother. "See that you go, and do not show your face again until you have a basketful of strawberries." Then she gave her a little piece of hard bread, and said, "This will last you the day," and thought, "You will die of cold and hunger outside. You will never be seen again by me." Then the maiden was obedient, and put on her paper frock, and went out with the basket. Far and wide there was nothing but snow, and not a green blade to be seen. When she got into the wood, she saw a small house, out of which peeped 3 little men. She wished them good day, and knocked modestly at the door. They cried, "Come in," and she entered the room and seated herself on a bench by the stove, where she began to warm herself and eat her breakfast. The little men said, "Give us some of it too." Willingly she said, and divided her piece of bread in 2, and gave them half. They asked, "What do you here in the forest in the winter time, in your thin dress?" "Ah," she answered, "I am to look for a basketful of strawberries, and I am not to go home until I can take them with me." When she had eaten her bread, they gave her a broom and said, "Sweep away the snow at the back door." But when she was outside, the 3 little men said to each other, "What shall we give her, as she is so good, and has shared her bread with us?" And then said the first, "My gift is, that she shall every day grow more beautiful." The second said, "My gift is that gold pieces shall fall out of her mouth every time she speaks." The third said, "My gift is that a king shall come and take her to wife." The girl, however, did as the little men had bidden her, swept away the snow behind the little house with the broom, and what did she find but real ripe strawberries, which came up quite dark red out of the snow. In her joy she hastily gathered her basketful, thanked the little men, shook hands with each of them, and ran home to take her stepmother what she had longed for so much. When she went in and said good evening, a piece of gold at once fell out of her mouth. Thereupon she related what had happened to her in the wood, but with every word she spoke, gold pieces fell from her mouth, until very soon the whole room was covered with them. "Now look at her arrogance," cried the stepsister, "to throw about gold in that way." But she was secretly envious of it, and wanted to go into the forest also to seek the strawberries. The mother said, "No, my dear little daughter, it is too cold, you might freeze to death." However, as her daughter let her have no peace, the mother at last yielded, made her a magnificent coat of fur, which she was obliged to put on, and gave her bread and butter and cake for her journey. The girl went into the forest and straight up to the little house. The 3 little men peeped out again, but she did not greet them, and without looking round at them, and without speaking to them, she went awkwardly into the room, seated herself by the stove, and began to eat her bread and butter and cake. "Give us some of it," cried the little men. But she replied, "There is not enough for myself, so how can I give it away to other people?" When she had finished eating, they said, "There is a broom for you. Sweep it all clean in front of the back door." "Sweep for yourselves," she answered. "I am not your servant." When she saw that they were not going to give her anything, she went out by the door. Then the little men said to each other, "What shall we give her, as she is so naughty, and has a wicked, envious heart, that will never let her do a good turn to anyone?" The first said, "I grant that she may grow uglier every day." The second said, "I grant that at every word she says a toad shall spring from her mouth." The third said, "I grant that she may die a miserable death." The maiden looked for strawberries outside, but as she found none, she went angrily home. And when she opened her mouth, she was about to tell her mother what had happened to her in the wood. With every word she said, a toad sprang out of her mouth, so that everyone was seized with horror of her. Then the stepmother was still more enraged, and thought of nothing but how to do every possible injury to the man's daughter, whose beauty, however, grew daily greater. At length she took a cauldron, set it on the fire, and boiled yarn in it. When it was boiled, she flung it on the poor girl's shoulder, and gave her an axe in order that she might go into the frozen river, cut a hole in the ice, and rinse the yarn. She was obedient, went thither, and cut a hole in the ice. And while she was in the midst of her cutting, a splendid carriage came driving up, in which sat a king. The carriage stopped, and the king said, "My child, who are you, and what are you doing here?" "I am a poor girl, and I am rinsing yarn." Then the king felt compassion, and when he saw that she was so very beautiful, he said to her, "Will you go away with me?" "Ah, yes, with all my heart," she answered, for she was glad to get away from the mother and sister. So she got into the carriage and drove away with the king, and when they arrived at his palace, the wedding was celebrated with a great pomp, as the little men had granted to the maiden. When a year was over, the young queen bore a son, and as the stepmother had heard of her great good fortune, she came with her daughter to the palace, and pretended that she wanted to pay her a visit. But when the king had gone out, and no one else was present, the wicked woman seized the queen by the head, and her daughter seized her by the feet, and they lifted her out of bed, and threw her out of the window into the stream which flowed by. Then the ugly daughter laid herself in the bed, and the old woman covered her up by her head. When the king came home again and wanted to speak with his wife, the old woman cried, "Hush, hush, that can't be now. She is lying in a violent sweat. You must let her rest today." The king suspected no evil, and did not come back again till next morning. And as he talked with his wife and she answered him, with every word a toad leaped out, whereas formerly a piece of gold had fallen. Then he asked what that could be, but the old woman said that she had got that from the violent sweat, and would soon lose it again. During the night, however, the scullion saw a duck come swimming up the gutter, and it said, "King, what art thou doing now? Sleepest thou, or wakest thou?" And as he returned no answer, it said, "And my guests, what may they do?" The scullion said, "They are sleeping soundly too." Then it asked again, "What does little baby mine?" He answered, "Sleepeth in her cradle fine." Then she went upstairs in the form of a queen, nursed the baby, shook up its little bed, covered it over, and then swam away again down the gutter in the shape of a duck. She came thus for 2 nights. On the third she said to the scullion, "Go and tell the king to take his sword and swing it 3 times over me on the threshold." Then the scullion ran and told this to the king, who came with his sword and swung it thrice over the spirit. And at the 3rd time his wife stood before him, strong, living, and healthy as she had been before. Thereupon the king was full of great joy, but he kept the queen hidden in a chamber until the Sunday, when the baby was to be christened. And when it was christened, he said, "What does a person deserve who drags another out of bed and throws him in the water?" "The wretch deserves nothing better," answered the old woman, "than to be taken and put in a barrel stuck full of nails, and rolled downhill into the water." "Then," said the king, "you have pronounced your own sentence." And he ordered such a barrel to be brought, and the old woman to be put into it with her daughter. And then the top was hammered on, and the barrel rolled down the hill until it went into the river. The 3 Spinners. There was once a girl who was idle and would not spin, and let her mother say what she would, she could not bring her to do it. At last the mother was once so overcome with anger and impatience that she beat her, at which the girl began to weep loudly. At this very moment the queen drove by, and when she heard the weeping she stopped her carriage, went into the house and asked the mother why she was beating her daughter so that the cries could be heard out on the road. Then the woman was ashamed to reveal the laziness of her daughter, and said, "I cannot get her to leave off spinning. She insists on spinning for ever and ever, and I am poor and cannot procure the flax." Then answered the queen, "There is nothing that I like better to hear than spinning, and I am never happier than when the wheels are humming. Let me have your daughter with me in the palace. I have flax enough, and there she shall spin as much as she likes." The mother was heartily satisfied with this, and the queen took the girl with her. When they had arrived at the palace, she led her up into 3 rooms which were filled from top to bottom with the finest flax. "Now spin me this flax," said she, "and when you have done it, you shall have my eldest son for a husband, even if you are poor. I care not for that, and your untiring industry is dowry enough." The girl was secretly terrified, for she could not have spun the flax. No, not if she had lived till she was 300 years old, and had sat at it every day from morning till night. When therefore she was alone, she began to weep, and sat thus for 3 days without moving a finger. On the 3rd day came the queen, and when she saw that nothing had yet been spun, she was surprised. But the girl excused herself by saying that she had not been able to begin because of her great distress at leaving her mother's house. The queen was satisfied with this, but said when she was going away, "Tomorrow you must begin work." When the girl was alone again, she did not know what to do, and in her distress went to the window. Then she saw 3 women coming towards her, the first of whom had a broad flat foot, the second had such a great underlip that it hung down over her chin, and the third had a broad thumb. They remained standing before the window, looked up, and asked the girl what was amiss with her. She complained of her trouble, and then they offered her their help and said, "If you will invite us to the wedding, and not be ashamed of us, and will call us your aunts, and likewise will place us at your table, we will spin up the flax for you, and that in a very short time." "With all my heart," she replied, "but do come in and begin the work at once." Then she led in the 3 strange women, and cleared a place in the first room, where they seated themselves and began their spinning. The one drew the thread and throttled the wheel, the other wetted the thread, and the third twisted it, and struck the table with her finger. And as often as she struck it, a skein of thread fell to the ground that was spun in the finest manner possible. The girl concealed the 3 spinners from the queen, and showed her whenever she came the great quantity of spun thread, until the latter could not praise her enough. When the first room was empty, she went to the second, and at last to the third, and that too was quickly cleared. Then the 3 women took leave and said to the girl, "Do not forget what you have promised us. It will make your fortune." When the maiden showed the queen the empty rooms and the great heap of yarn, she gave orders for the wedding, and the bridegroom rejoiced that he was to have such a clever and industrious wife, and praised her mightily. "I have 3 aunts," said the girl, "and as they have been very kind to me, I should not like to forget them in my good fortune. Allow me to invite them to the wedding, and let them sit with us at table." The queen and the bridegroom said, "Why, we would not allow that." Therefore, when the feast began, the 3 women entered in strange apparel, and the bride said, "Welcome, dear aunts." "Ah," said the bridegroom, "how do you come by these odious friends?" Thereupon he went to the one with the broad flat foot, and said, "How do you come by such a broad foot?" "By threading," she answered, "by threading." Then the bridegroom went to the second, and said, "How do you come by your falling lip?" "By licking," she answered, "by licking." Then he asked the third, "How do you come by your broad thumb?" "By twisting the thread," she answered, "by twisting the thread." On this the king's son was alarmed, and said, "Neither now nor ever shall my beautiful bride touch a spinning wheel." And thus she got rid of the hateful flax spinning. Hansel and Gretel. Hard by a great forest dwelt a poor woodcutter with his wife and 2 children. The boy was called Hansel, and the girl Gretel. He had little to bite and to break, and once when the great dearth fell on the land, he could no longer procure even daily bread. Now when he thought over this by night in his bed, and tossed about in his anxiety, he groaned and said to his wife, "What is to become of us? How are we to feed our poor children, when we no longer have anything even for ourselves?" "I'll tell you what, husband," answered the woman. "Early tomorrow morning we will take the children out into the forest, to where it is thickest. There we will light a fire for them, and give each of them 1 more piece of bread. Then we will go to our work and leave them alone. They will not find a way home again, and we shall be rid of them." "No, wife," said the man, "I will not do that. How can I bear to leave my children alone in the forest? The wild animals would soon come and tear them to pieces." "Oh, you fool," said she, "then we must all four die of hunger. You may as well plane the planks for our coffins." And she left him no peace until he consented. "But I feel very sorry for the poor children, all the same," said the man. The two children also had not been able to sleep for hunger, and had heard what their stepmother had said to their father. Gretel wept bitter tears, and said to Hansel, "Now all is over with us." "Be quiet, Gretel," said Hansel. "Do not distress yourself. I will soon find a way to help us." And when the old folks had fallen asleep, he got up, put on his little coat, opened the door below, and crept outside. The moon shone brightly, and the white pebbles which lay in front of the house glittered like real silver pennies. Hansel stooped and stuffed the little pocket of his coat with as many as he could get in. Then he went back and said to Gretel, "Be comforted, dear little sister, and sleep in peace. God will not forsake us." And he lay down again in his bed. When day dawned, but before the sun had risen, the woman came and awoke the two children, saying, "Get up, you sluggards. We're going into the forest to fetch wood." She gave each a little piece of bread and said, "There is something for your dinner, but do not eat it up before then, for you will get nothing else." Gretel took the bread under her apron, as Hansel had the pebbles in his pocket. Then they all set out together on the way to the forest. When they had walked a short time, Hansel stood still and peeped back at the house, and did so again and again. His father said, "Hansel, what are you looking at there and staying behind for? Pay attention, and do not forget how to use your legs." "Ah, father," said Hansel, "I am looking at my little white cat, which is sitting up on the roof, and wants to say goodbye to me." The wife said, "Fool, that is not your little cat. That is the morning sun which is shining on the chimneys." Hansel, however, had not been looking back at the cat, but had been constantly throwing one of the white pebble stones out of his pocket and onto the road. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "Now, children, pile up some wood, and I will light a fire that you may not be cold." Hansel and Gretel gathered the brushwood together, as high as a little hill. The brushwood was lighted, and when the flames were burning very high, the woman said, "Now, children, lay yourselves down by the fire and rest. We will go into the forest and cut some wood. When we have done, we will come back and fetch you away." Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and when noon came, each ate a little piece of the bread. And as they heard the strokes of the wood axe, they believed their father was near. It was not the axe, however, but a branch that he had fastened to the withered tree, which the wind was blowing backwards and forwards. And as they had been sitting such a long time, their eyes closed with fatigue, and they fell fast asleep. When at last they woke, it was already dark night. Gretel began to cry and said, "How are we going to get out of the forest now?" But Hansel comforted her and said, "Just wait a little, until the moon has risen, and then we will soon find the way." And when the full moon had risen, Hansel took his little sister by the hand, and followed the pebbles which had shone like newly coined silver pieces, and showed them the way. They walked the whole night long, and by break of day came once more to their father's house. They knocked at the door, and when the woman opened it and saw that it was Hansel and Gretel, she said, "You naughty children, why have you slept so long in the forest? We thought you were never coming back at all." The father, however, rejoiced, for it had cut him in the heart to leave them behind alone. Not long afterwards, there was once more a great dearth throughout the land, and the children heard their mother saying at night to their father, "Everything is eaten again. We have 1/2 loaf left, and that is the end. The children must go. We will take them further into the wood, so that they will not find their way out again. There is no other means of saving ourselves." The man's heart was heavy, and he thought, "It would be better for you to share the last mouthful with your children." The woman, however, would listen to nothing that he had to say, but scolded and reproached him. He who says A must say B likewise, and as he had yielded the first time, he had to do so a second time also. The children, however, were still awake and had heard the conversation. When the old folks were asleep, Hansel again got up, and wanted to go out and pick some pebbles as he had done before, but the woman had locked the door, and Hansel could not get out. Nevertheless, he comforted his little sister and said, "Do not cry, Gretel. Go to sleep quietly. The good God will help us." Early in the morning came the woman, and took the children out of their beds. Their piece of bread was given to them, but it was still smaller than the time before. On the way into the forest, Hansel crumbled his into his pocket, and often stood still and threw a morsel on the ground. "Hansel, why do you stop and look around?" said the father. "Go on." "I am looking back at my little pigeon, which is sitting on the roof, and wants to say good-bye to me," answered Hansel. "Fool," said the woman, "that is not your little pigeon, that is the morning sun that is shining on the chimney." Hansel, however, little by little, threw all the crumbs on the path. The woman led the children still deeper into the forest, where they had never in their lives been before. Then a great fire was again made, and the mother said, "Just sit there, you children, and when you are tired you may sleep a little. We are going into the forest to cut wood, and in the evening, when we're done, we will come and fetch you away." When it was noon, Gretel shared her piece of bread with Hansel, who had scattered his by the way. Then they fell asleep and evening passed, but no one came to the poor children. They did not wake until it was dark night, and Hansel comforted his little sister and said, "Just wait, Gretel, until the moon rises, and then we shall see our crumbs of bread which I have strewn about. They will show us our way home again." When the moon came, they set out, but they found no crumbs, for many thousands of birds which fly about in the woods and fields had picked them all up. Hansel said to Gretel, "We shall soon find the way," but they did not find it. They walked the whole night and all the next day too, from morning till evening, but they did not get out of the forest, and were very hungry, for they had nothing to eat but 2 or 3 berries, which grew on the ground. And as they were so weary that their legs would carry them no longer, they lay down beneath a tree and fell asleep. It was now 3 mornings since they had left their father's house. They began to walk again, but they always come deeper into the forest, and if help did not come soon, they must die of hunger and weariness. When it was midday, they saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a bough, which sang so delightfully that they stood still and listened to it. And when its song was over, it spread its wings and flew away before them, and they followed it until they reached a little house, on the roof of which it alighted. And when they approached the little house, they saw that it was built of bread and covered with cakes, but that the windows were of clear sugar. "We will set to work on that," said Hansel, "and have a good meal. I will eat a bit of the roof, and you, Gretel, can eat some of the window. It will taste sweet." Hansel reached up above and broke off a little piece of the roof to try how it tasted, and Gretel leant against the window and nibbled at the panes. Then a soft voice cried from the parlor, "Nibble, nibble, gnaw, who is nibbling at my little house?" The children answered, "The wind, the heaven-born wind," and went on eating without disturbing themselves. Hansel, who liked the taste of the roof, tore down a great piece of it, and Gretel pushed out the whole of one round window-pane, and sat down, and enjoyed herself with it. Suddenly the door opened, and a woman as old as the hills, who supported herself on crutches, came creeping out. Hansel and Gretel were so terribly frightened that they had let fall what they had in their hands. The old woman, however, nodded her head and said, "Oh, you dear children, who has brought you here? Do come in and stay with me. No harm shall happen to you." She took them both by the hand and led them into her little house. Then good food was set before them, milk and pancakes, with sugar, apples, and nuts. Afterwards 2 pretty little beds were covered with clean white linen, and Hansel and Gretel lay down in them and thought they were in heaven. The old woman had only pretended to be so kind. She was in reality a wicked witch, who lay in wait for children, and had only built the little house of bread in order to entice them there. When a child fell into her power, she killed it, cooked it, and ate it, and that was a feast day with her. Witches have red eyes and cannot see far, but they have keen scent like the beasts, and are aware when human beings draw near. When Hansel and Gretel came into her neighborhood, she laughed with malice, and said mockingly, "I have them. They shall not escape me again." Early in the morning, before the children were awake, she was already up, and when she saw both of them sleeping and looking so pretty, with their plump and rosy cheeks, she muttered to herself, "That will be a dainty mouthful." Then she seized Hansel with her shriveled hand, carried him into the little stable, and locked him behind a gated door. Scream as he might, it would not help him. Then she went to Gretel, shook her till she awoke, and cried, "Get up, lazy thing, fetch some water, and cook something good for your brother. He is in the stable outside, and is to be made fat. When he is fat, I will eat him." Gretel began to weep bitterly, but it was all in vain, for she was forced to do what the wicked witch commanded. And now the best food was cooked for poor Hansel, but Gretel got nothing but crab shells. Every morning the woman crept into the little stable and cried, "Hansel, stretch out your finger that I may feel if you will soon be fat." Hansel, however, stretched out a little bone to her, and the old woman, who had dim eyes, could not see it, and thought it was Hansel's finger, and was astonished that there was no way of fattening him. When 4 weeks had gone by and Hansel still remained thin, she was seized with impatience and would not wait any longer. "Now then, Gretel," she cried to the girl, "stir yourself and bring some water. Let Hansel be fat or lean, tomorrow I will kill him and cook him." Ah, how the poor little sister did lament when she had to fetch for the water, and how her tears did flow down her cheeks. "Dear God, do help us," she cried. "If the wild beasts in the forest had but devoured us, we should at any rate have died together." "Just keep your noise to yourself," said the old woman. "It won't help you at all." Early in the morning, Gretel had to go out and hang up the cauldron with the water and light the fire. "We will bake first," said the old woman. "I have already heated the oven and kneaded the dough." She pushed poor Gretel out to the oven, from which flames of fire were already darting. "Creep in," said the witch, "and see if it properly heated, so that we can put the bread in." And once Gretel was inside, she intended to shut the oven and let her bake in it, and then she would eat her too. But Gretel saw what she had in mind, and said, "I do not know how I am to do it. How do I get in?" "Silly goose," said the old woman, "the door is big enough. Just look, I can get in myself." And she crept up and thrusted her head into the oven. Then Gretel gave her a push that drove her far into it, and shut the iron door, and fastened the bolt. Oh, then she began to howl quite horribly, but Gretel ran away, and the godless witch was miserably burnt to death. Gretel, however, ran like lightning to Hansel, opened his little stable, and cried, "Hansel, we're saved! The old witch is dead." Then Hansel sprang like a bird from its cage when the door is opened. How they did rejoice and embrace each other, and dance about and kiss each other. And as they had no longer any need to fear her, they went into the witch's house, and in every corner there stood chests full of pearls and jewels. "These are far better than pebbles," said Hansel, and thrust them into his pockets wherever could be got in. And Gretel said, "I too will take something home with me," and filled her pinafore full. "But now we must be off," said Hansel, "that we may get out of the witch's forest." When they had walked for 2 hours, they came to a great stretch of water. "We cannot cross," said Hansel. "I see no foot-plank and no bridge." "And there is also no ferry," answered Gretel, "but a white duck is swimming there. If I ask her, she will help us over." Then she cried, little duck, dost thou see? Hansel and Gretel are waiting for thee. There's never a plank or a bridge in sight. Take us across on thy back so white." The duck came to them, and Hansel seated himself on its back, and told his sister to sit by him. "No," replied Gretel, "that'll be too heavy for the little duck. She shall take us across one after the other." The good little duck did so, and when they were once safely across, and had walked for a short time, the forest seemed to be more and more familiar to them, and at length they saw from afar their father's house. Then they began to run, rushed into the parlor, and threw themselves round their father's neck. The man had not known one happy hour since he had left the children in the forest. The woman, however, was dead. Gretel emptied her pinafore until pearls and precious stones ran about the room, and Hansel threw one handful after another out of his pocket to add to them. Then all anxiety was at an end, and they lived together in perfect happiness.